Today on the Carolina Storyteller, we're going to be talking about something everybody's heard about, but are we really getting it right? You know, those blood-sucking creatures that infest the media. I'm not talking about politicians. I'm talking about vampires. This is the Carolina Storyteller.
In the dark woods where shadows creep, stories rise as the campfire reaps. John at the voice, a haunting thrill. With every tale he bends on will. Echoes whisper, the night draws near. By the firelight, our fears collide. The Carolina Storyteller, our guide. Through the spooky, the feathering fight. Fables of darkness igniting the night. Of the night.
Welcome, folks, to the Carolina Storyteller. I want to remind you, if you want to support the show, you can go over to patreon.com/the Carolina Storyteller and get a look at everything that we've got going on and help pay for all of this and everything that's going to be going on in the future. This week, we're starting a multi-part discussion on vampires. You know, the creatures that uh, hide in the outer reaches of the world and prey upon the blood of the living. And only they come out at night and they sleep in coffins, right? That's what they are. Well, depends on who you ask. So the first part of this discussion is we're going to go back to what a vampire actually is. And believe it or not, vampires are actually specific to one region and one region only. There are many vampiric creatures, and a lot of creatures get confused with them. Just an example, I'm just going to read you some names real quick. The Alp, the Azama, the Bayatal, which is from India, uh, as if you couldn't tell. The Buhag is considered a vampiric creature, and we've already talked about that before. Even the Chupacabra is considered vampiric. So is the Chiripe, the Drafmir, the Dragor, which is a Norse, and I may have mispronounced that horribly. The Ike. Anyway, I could go on for hours just naming different types of vampiric creatures. I really could. I don't have all day to do that. So today we're just going to talk about vampires themselves. Where do they come from? The actual legends of vampires actually originated in southeastern and eastern Europe around, some people say it was the 18th century, but it was really closer to the 14th century that these legends really started up. There was actually in, I believe it was 1485, a man who was originally accused of being a vampire. And this is when the word originated. So the story goes is that this man, he lived a dishonest life. He was an abusive husband. He was a philanderer. He was a lot of horrible things. And when he died, of course, his soul did not go on. And at night, the town began to suffer strange, mysterious goings-ons where people would be killed in the middle of the night, it seemed, by mysterious forces. Well, they die in the middle of the night, but it didn't seem natural. A lot of the uh, aspects of what we call vampire were in these deaths. They appeared to be dehydrated or exsanguinated. And medically, there may have been many excuses for one or two of these, but this was a large number. Now, what turned everybody to this guy was that his wife um, suddenly reported seeing him, haunting her, to the point that he actually assaulted her in the night while she was trying to sleep. He would come back home and have his way with her. And she began reporting it to the local priest. Um, Don't know why she didn't report it to the cops. I guess when it's, a dead guy, you go to a priest before you go to the cops. That makes sense to me. I'm not 100% sure. But that's what she did. And so the priest began looking for this guy. And this is where the idea of religious iconography in vampires probably originates from, because the legend goes is that the priest ended up confronting this guy and realizing it was him, held out the cross in front of him and rebuked him in the name of Jesus Christ. It was believed that his spirit had become a revenant and re-inhabited his body. And in order to keep the body, he had to drink blood. But that's just his case, because there's so much more to get into when it comes to vampires from Middle Eastern Europe, sorry, not Middle Eastern, Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe. Now, when I'm talking about these, I'm talking about your Slovakias, your Transylvanias, anything that ends with an ania, basically. Austria, um, even Switzerland. Okay, all of these places today border areas like Ukraine, Czechoslovakia, Poland, all the way into Moscow. This is the area that we're talking about. We're talking about a huge swath of the European continent where they believed that these creatures existed. Now, one of the beliefs that they had with these creatures was that they were reanimated corpses uh, brought back by evil. Now, they weren't 100% sure how it happened. Um, Generally, they believed that it was a revenant spirit. The spirit was not able to leave, so it brought its body back after death. And then, because it was undead, it had to take life in order to have life. So it became this vicious cycle. But what was interesting is that they had another term out there for children born from vampires. Hold on now. I know what you're saying. Children born from vampires? That's absolutely right. The legends from this time believed in something called a Draupnir, or a half-blood vampire. Now, these were children that were born either a male, normally a male vampire father, and a human woman who either was enticed or unenticed to bear a child of the vampire, or they could come from a vampiric mother and a human male who, for whatever reason, decided he was going to bang a vampire. And these children would have vampiric like qualities. Um, they would be similar to vampires, but they wouldn't have what they called the bloodlust and the thirst that vampires had. And generally, these children were chosen to be vampire hunters. So this was a real thing, just like witch hunting was a real thing back in, the 15, 1600s and 1700s. Vampire hunters were a real thing before all of that. There were people out there hunting vampires, and they were usually the children of vampires. They would be raised kind of by the church almost, because their mother would, of course, be either mother or father would, of course, be ostracized by the community. So the church would take these children in and raise them to hunt the evil spawn that created them. Now, during all of this time, we had a lot of interesting characters. And of course, one of those interesting characters was Vlad Tepes. Now, Vlad Tepes, for those of you who do not know, was a count. He had a country basically that he ran, and that was Transylvania. Big surprise. Uh, he became known as Vlad the Impaler. Now, he had what scientists today call a genetic disorder. He was allergic to sunlight. Um, Vlad was a very bloodthirsty man, and to show how powerful he was, he did this thing with his enemies where when he would kill them, he would put their heads upon the pikes, but after he killed them and he cut the heads off, he'd collect the blood and drink it. Now, this was supposed to, in his mind, I'm assuming by everybody's retelling of it, it's made him seem like he was a badass. This was the, oh, look at how bad Vlad Tepes is. He's so tough that he's cutting off people's heads and sticking them on a pike. He wanted to instill fear. What he did was create a legend. And that legend ended up being turned into a book by a man named Bram Stoker. And we all know this as Dracula. This is where the legend of Dracula really came from, is it came from a very real person who did some very horrible real things. And a writer got a hold of it and transferred it. But where everybody's like, oh, vampires are fiction. No, vampires, by all accounts, legends, and lore truly existed. They truly hound some of these places. And it wasn't just in Southeastern Europe. If we fast forward a couple of hundred years, there were stories of vampires in England, there were stories of vampires in France, and even in the United States of America, there was a legend of a vampire. We've already covered it, and her name was Mercy Brown. Now, what's interesting is that her story is that she died, and because she died in the winter, they couldn't bury her yet. But as she died, after she died, other people got sick. They started getting sick, they started getting ill, and they started dying. All of something that nobody else could see. The doctors couldn't figure it out. But when they went to check on Mercy, I'm sorry, when they went to check on her, she still looked healthy, even though she was dead. So they performed this autopsy, and there was blood still in the heart. Now, today, scientists will probably tell you, well, yeah, that's a natural, common occurrence. But I'm pretty sure that if you found fresh blood in the heart back in the 1800s and you had everybody dying, well, then you'd have to do something. So they ended up burning her heart and making a tincture with the ashes for one of her relatives who was sick because she was preying on her own family, supposedly. And then they sent him away and he got better. So it could have been the conditions of the area were making him get worse, but he did still end up dying of what was known as consumption, but it was a year or two later. So it did not appear for a long period of time that he was affected by his sister, the vampire Mercy Brown. Now it's interesting that vampires have made it this far, but a lot of people don't get just how prevalent these things were. From Poland to Russia, they were all trying to figure out how to deal with them, and they had different methods of dealing with vampires. It varied from staking, which was the most common method, to burning them, to cutting off the head, and even stuffing the head with garlic. And then they would put the head behind the buttocks when they buried it back in the ground. Buttocks, not buttocks. Forgive me for saying it like that. Believing that that way the head couldn't get back. They would do things like drive iron needles into the corpse to pin it in place so that it could not move, uh, putting pins through the mouth and over the eyes so that it could not open its mouth or eyes to move. All kinds of things. Pouring boiling water over the grave and sprinkling it with holy water afterwards. They even went as so far as to perform exorcisms over the grave to deal with these creatures. And this is things that people actually did. This isn't like, oh, it's some legend. This happened a lot. So much so that it was considered common practice and people were taught how to do these things because they thought that they needed to know in case they had to deal with the threat of a vampire. Now, vampires are traditionally not believed to be natural beings. However, there are some Eastern European legends that state that these beings were actually created and were from Persia, possibly descendants of Lilith, of all people, who in Persian lore is a demon, but in other lore, she was the first woman who defied God when she was supposed to kneel before Adam. So these things have been around for thousands of years. Well, not by that name, because the name vampire only originates from Eastern Europe. Like I said, they have so many other names for so many other creatures that are so different. So, what makes a vampire? Well, believe it or not, there is a criteria as to what a vampire is, how to identify it. Um, you had to look for a vampire's grave by leading a virgin boy to a graveyard or church grounds on a virgin stallion. The horse would then supposedly balk at the grave in question. Generally, a black horse was required, though in Albania it was supposed to be white. If there were holes appearing in earth over a grave, this was a sign of vampire. Corpses that were thought to be vampire were generally described as having a healthier appearance than expected, plump and showing little to no signs of decomposition. In many cases, when the graves were opened, the villagers described the corpse of having a lifelike appearance, fresh blood of a victim over its face, evidence that this vampire had eaten soon. And the way you could tell a vampire was in your community if no one was dying is that animals would die because vampires didn't need human life. They just needed life. They needed blood. So they could prey upon cattle, they could prey upon dogs, they could eat your cats. Hmm. I wonder if we had vampires during the 2024 election and nobody figured that out. Well, oh no. Somebody get to Chicago. Anyway, the point being is that there were signs that a vampire was there. But what if the vampire wasn't in the grave? Well, that was the thing is that it didn't have to be in the grave. You could also take the whole investigation thing near where you suspected the vampire to live. In fact, it was believed that if there was poltergeist style activity in a home, it was a possibility that a vampire could be living there or had been living there at some point in time. It was even believed in some parts that a person could only turn into a vampire if they were descended from a vampire in some way, adding more weight to the idea of Drothmir, you know, half vampires. Supposedly, Drothmir, if they died, would turn into a full vampire. Therefore, whenever one of them was around, if they kicked the bucket, it was off with the head, stake through the heart, nails through everything. A lot of work going in to dealing with vampires. Vampires were considered to be humanoid. They may have supernatural abilities. They could shapeshift, even turning themselves into mist to slip through cracks in the door so that they could get into the house, which is weird because they apparently also had rules they had to stand by. They couldn't cross a threshold unless they were invited in. So, unless you invited a vampire into your house, you didn't have to worry about the vampire coming in. You had to say, hey, come on in, have some supper before the vampire could get to you. And if you barred a vampire from your house by specifically stating it was no longer invited, they had to leave and they couldn't come back in. So your home basically became a protective place, which is why people would rush to be home at night and why there were so many stories about don't go out at night. The vampire might get you, because apparently the threshold of the home held some kind of magical protection that kept them at bay. But if you allowed one in, that's all she wrote. She'd be coming in for forever, or he, or they, however they identify. I don't know. I'm not vampire gender expert. That's not me. That's somebody over there. Anyway, the point of this is I want to get the basis of what a vampire actually is. So a vampire, by their standards, is a creature uh, either having lived or living, or either having lived or existing as an undead state requiring the drinking of another's life force in order to continue its life. Um, they would appear um, undead, yet at the same time not. They would have like they'd have the blue tinted skin of being dead. It looked like they died, but they'd still look pretty good, even though they died. You know, if you are getting what I'm saying. Um, they would have to sleep during the day because the sunlight hurt them. Now, this could be because the sunlight probably sped up decomposition and they're decomposing. Everything they're doing is try to stall that process a little bit longer. So sunlight hurt them. Religious economy drove them away. And believe it or not, it didn't say Christian religious economy. Though the priest was Christian in the story that I told, there are other tales of other religions where they were able to call upon their gods for the power to drive the vampire out. So if we're making a list here, if you want to know if it's a vampire, the first thing that has to deal with is that it's got to be dead, or at least resembling dead. It's got to look healthy, even though it's dead. Very weird to combine the two, but that's two of the things. You're going to have a whole bunch of things dying around you, whether it's people, livestock. There's just going to be a lot of death. Graves may or may not be disturbed, but if there's a disturbed grave, you might have a vampire or grave robbers. Who knows? Probably a vampire. Get the stakes ready. It is allergic to sunlight, and it does not do well with religious economy. So, for those of you who thought being Italian and cooking spaghetti all the time was going to protect you, guess what? Garlic isn't on the list. However, ash, and I believe it's hemlock wood, ash and some other kind of wood. I'm gonna look here to make sure I understand it. um, Wild rose, hawthorn were used to hold them out, even mustard seeds. Garlic is something that has come along, but it was not typically used. Um, Also, if you consecrated the ground around your town, supposedly, if you blessed the town, they could not enter. And it was ash and aspen. Ash, hawthorn, and aspen were the three types of wood that were used primarily to battle and defeat vampires. So this is part one, and we've gotten what is a vampire. Part two, we're going to talk about the media and vampires and how far they've kind of gotten off of the list. And even though they're off the list, are they actually correct but referencing something else? Uh, this has been the Carolina Storyteller. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed. And remember to go over to patreon.com/the Carolina Storyteller to support the show, get all kinds of new stuff, neat stuff. We've got a merch store that you can get the link to there. And oh, yeah, stay spooky, my friends. We'll see you next time.